Hi all, so today we finally get into the textbook. So this lecture will be on chapter 1 of James Rachel's The Elements of Moral Philosophy. The section is entitled What is Morality? So the way that the chapter is structured is Rachel's considers some interesting medical cases, considers arguments on both sides of the cases, and then tries to develop out of the discussion some features that he believes that any acceptable moral theory will hold. So instead of offering a crisp definition at the beginning, he goes through these cases and develops his definition. Since morality and ethics is so contentious, it's a good method to try to come up with a definition. All right, so let's jump in. The first case he discusses is the case of baby Teresa, and so that we're on the same page while I'm discussing the arguments, I'll read some bits of it. Teresa Ann Campo Pearson, an infant known to the public as baby Teresa, was born in Florida in 1992. She had anencephaly, one of the worst genetic disorders. Anencephalic infants are sometimes referred to as babies without brains, but that is not quite accurate. Important parts of the brain, the cerebrum and cerebellum, are missing, as is the top of the skull. The brainstem, however, is still there, and so the baby can breathe and possess a heartbeat. In the United States, most cases of anencephaly are detected during pregnancy, and the fetuses are usually aborted. Of those not aborted, half are stillborn. Only a few hundred are born alive each year, and they usually die within days. Baby Teresa's story is remarkable only because her parents made an unusual request. Knowing that the baby would die soon and could never be conscious, Teresa's parents volunteered her organs for immediate transplant. They thought that her kidneys, liver, heart, lungs, and eyes should go to other children who could benefit from them. Her physicians agreed. Thousands of infants need transplants each year, and there are never enough organs available. But Teresa's organs were not taken because Florida law forbids the removal of organs until the donor has died. By the time baby Teresa died 9 days later, it was too late. Her organs had deteriorated too much to be harvested and transplanted. So it's a heartbreaking, but interesting case, worthy of discussion. There are many interesting questions that this case brings up. So one question is, should baby Teresa's organs be harvested, which would in effect be killing her, and her organs distributed to other babies who could use them for longer lives? That's the question we'll actually be focusing entirely on. There's another interesting question, which is who has the authority to make this decision, or who should have the authority? In this case, the parents and doctors wanted to do one thing, and the law forbid them from doing it. In other cases, we will see that the parents wanted to make a decision, and the law made it so that they couldn't make that decision. It's interesting to wonder who has the authority to make these decisions about their children. Do parents have special do they have extra access to the moral facts about their children? It doesn't seem that that's the case, but do they have the right, given that they're their children? It's a tricky issue. It's one that we're going to be setting completely aside. We have to narrow our focus in this topic. It is an interesting question that will reoccur at various times in the class. Who has the authority to make these decisions? But since the question of what should be done in these scenarios is so complex already, we're going to set that question aside for now. All right, so the first argument that Rachel's considers about this case is the benefits argument. The benefits argument goes like this: if we can benefit someone without harming someone else, we ought to do so. Transplanting the organs would benefit the other children without harming baby Teresa. Therefore, we ought to transplant the organs. So this argument focuses on the good, the benefits that can come out of harvesting and distributing baby Teresa's organs to the other babies that can use them. Now, as we went over in our last lecture, there are two ways to object to arguments, or at least two of the most fundamental ways to object to arguments are to look at the premises and ask two questions. If those premises are true, would they lead to the conclusion? Would they give us enough reason to believe the conclusion? And second, are the premises in fact true? So let's take the first question first. If these premises are true, would they lead to the conclusion? So if it were true that if we can benefit someone without harming someone else, we ought to do so, that seems fairly straightforward. There might be some counterexamples, but they would be very few. But before we get to considering whether it's true or not, imagine it's true that if we can benefit someone without harming someone else, we ought to do so. And imagine it were true that transplanting the organs would benefit the other children without harming baby Teresa. Would that give us enough reason to believe the conclusion that we ought to transplant the organs? It seems so. So this passes the first test, but now what about the second test? Well, the first premise again, if we can benefit someone without harming someone else, we ought to do so. Like I said, that seems to be true. The counterexamples might be very few and far between. It seems like the morally correct thing to do. So it seems that this moral principle is acceptable. It seems that that premise is true. But how about premise two? Transplanting the organs would benefit the other children. That part seems true, but how about the second part, without harming baby Teresa? That seems open to a very obvious objection. The obvious objection would be, well, hold on, harvesting and transplanting the organs would entail killing baby Teresa. And in normal cases, killing is, we think of killing as a case of harming. So ending somebody's life would be harming them in some sense by depriving them of their future, maybe. So while this passes the proper form test, the objection would say this doesn't pass the true premise test. Premise two is objectionable. So how might somebody respond to this objection that, look, it's killing baby Teresa isn't killing an example of harming? Rachel tries to respond to this objection by saying, well, while killing normal people is an example or an instance of harming them, killing baby Teresa actually doesn't harm her. And why doesn't it harm her? It says the reason that people might be harmed by killing is that it takes away a future which they might value now or come to value at some point in the future. But note about baby Teresa, the details of the case told us that she doesn't have the ability to value her future now, nor will she ever gain that ability. It's a terminal case, and she doesn't have the necessary brain parts to ever be conscious or to ever do any valuing at all, let alone her own life. So to hold something as good or bad requires a certain amount of mental sophistication that she just doesn't have and won't develop. So maybe we can start seeing that maybe killing baby Teresa isn't a case of harming her, because her case is rather unique in that sort of way. And if that doesn't get you on board, there's one thought experiment that I thought of that might apply to this case. So, and it can start to help us get our head around what it is about our lives that we value and what it is about death that would be harmful to us. Consider a case. Imagine somebody gave you two options. The first option was in 5 minutes you were going to die. And that was going to be the end of everything. You were just going to be dead in 5 minutes. That was option A. Dire, dreary, I know. So, and then option B would be in 5 minutes, you would be put into a coma. In that coma, you would have no thoughts whatsoever. Your heart would continue beating, your lungs would continue breathing, but you would have no thoughts, no feelings for the next 50 years. And then at the end of that 50 years, you would never awake. There was no chance that you would awake from that coma. And at the end of 50 years, you would die. So I would ask, which of those would you prefer? And imagine, for the sake of this thought experiment, set aside what might happen to anybody else, right? So the effects that you being in a coma might have to other people, the effects that you being dead might have for other people. Consider this just from your perspective, and consider it from the perspective of what would be best for you, right? Well, when I think about that question, which of those two options would be best for me, I find that it's hard to decide because I'm just totally indifferent as to whether it would be better for me to, whether I would want to die in 5 minutes or whether I'd want to be put in that coma in 5 minutes that I would never come out of and never have thoughts again or feelings again. And to me, that illustrates a point that Rachel's is trying to make here, that our mere biological existence doesn't seem to be the thing that we really value about life. Now, it's the foundation upon which the things that we do value in life are built. But if I had the choice to just merely maintain biological existence, my own biological existence, with none of the things we more colloquially call having a life, or just to die, I would have no preference as far as how that it would affect me, right? So if this was me in this situation, I would think I would be strictly indifferent about dying or living the extra time if I were not going to have thoughts or feelings. Of course, she can't consider this thought experiment because she doesn't have the mental complexity to have the thoughts. But maybe that can get us to start getting our head around this idea that maybe killing Teresa is not actually harming her because of the details of her case. So let's consider the next argument. The next argument is, again, against, the first argument was that we should perform the operation. This is that we should not perform the operation. The argument that we should not use people as means. So the premises go, first, it is wrong to use people as means to other people's ends. 2, taking Teresa's organs would be using her to benefit the other children. Therefore, we should not take her organs. So first, let's talk about some of the terminology here. So what does it mean to use somebody as a means to other people's ends? You can think of this simply as using one person as a tool for other people's ends, for other people's benefit, right? So using somebody as a tool for another's benefit. And the first premise says it's wrong to do that. And in normal cases, it does seem wrong to do that, especially when the person being so used doesn't consent to it, right? And since Teresa isn't consenting to be used in this way, it seems that it would be clearly wrong, right? So if going back to the trolley problems, it might have struck some of you as wrong to use the fat man as a trolley brake, especially because he didn't consent to it, right? So using him as a tool, a trolley brake for the other people's benefit, for saving their lives, this first principle would seem to rule that out, right? And it also seems to rule out taking Teresa's organs since she doesn't consent to it. But one thing, again, the text points out here is, the text presents an objection here to premise 2. The objection goes like this. Premise 2 is not true. And the reason it's not true is because or maybe the better way, yeah, I'll go with the objection is against the truth of premise 2. So even if it's true that it's wrong to use people as a means to other people's ends, the thing that's objectionable about using people as tools for other people's benefits is that you violate their autonomy. You might go against their wishes. Those wishes might be explicit. They might say, don't do this with me. And then if you use them as a tool, then you would be violating their autonomy, their right to self-determination. And even if they're unable to currently give their consent, or you're unable to ask them, it might be that you go against their wishes for how they would agree to be used, what purposes they would be agree to be used for. So you might be violating their autonomy in that way. But again, note the details of Teresa's case make this argument and this objection interesting. It doesn't seem like we could violate Teresa's autonomy because she doesn't have autonomy. She doesn't have the freedom to choose what she wants or what she can or cannot be used for. Why? Again, because she just doesn't have the mental sophistication to decide what she wants to be used for and prohibit people from using her in one way or the other. In fact, it doesn't seem that she has the mental capacity to have any desires whatsoever. So while normally it might be wrong to use people for your own or other people's benefits without their consent, the reason that might be wrong is because you might have the possibility of going against their wishes. But it would be impossible to go against Teresa's wishes. Why? Because she doesn't have wishes. And not only that, she will never develop the ability to have wishes for how she would want to be treated or how she would want to be used. So the book, Rachel's and our author concludes that that this argument doesn't actually apply to her. That premise 2 is false if more cleanly written, that it wouldn't be using her as a means to benefit the other children. In fact, maybe I'll make that change in our PowerPoint here. So yeah, this objection would be against the truth of premise 2. So it wouldn't be objectionably using her as a means. All right, so let's consider another argument. Maybe this was the first argument that might have occurred to you about this case, the argument from the wrongness of killing. And we talked a little bit about this in the trolley problem. So it's wrong to kill one person to save another. Taking Teresa's organs would be killing her to save others. Therefore, we should not take her organs. Again, and you'll note this in all the arguments that we've considered so far, we have a moral principle for premise 1. We have the facts about the case, or a claim about the facts about the case in premise 2, and then a judgment drawn from the application of the moral principle to the facts about the case. And note that occurs in all of these 3 arguments here, and all the arguments in this chapter. We have a moral principle up top, a statement of fact about the case, and then the conclusion. It's the same here. So this argument, the moral principle invoked, is it's wrong to kill one person to save another. The facts about the case, taking Teresa's organs would be killing her to save others. Therefore, we should not take her organs. I'll say this passes the first test again. If these premises are true, they lead to the conclusion that we should not take her organs. But let's stop and wonder again about the truth of the premises. So is it true that it's wrong to kill one person to save another? One objection that the text doesn't bring up that might be brought up here is this would rule out the moral permissibility of self-defense. Self-defense is killing one person to save another, specifically yourself, right? So we might have our doubts about premise 1 if it's always wrong to kill one person to save another. Now, maybe we could clean up that premise a little bit to allow for the morality of self-defense. We might say something like, it's wrong to kill one person to save, it's wrong to kill an innocent person to save another, right? And here, baby Teresa's innocent. She's not doing anything wrong, right? So that would, while the person killing somebody in self-defense is presumably killing somebody who's doing something wrong. So if we cleaned up the principle in that way, it's wrong to kill an innocent person to save another. Well, now we would rule as permissible self-defense while ruling out killing baby Teresa. So now that principle seems on the face of it like it might be true. trolley problems aside. When we discuss the trolley problems, pulling the lever might be killing the one person to save other people, and the person on the other track was innocent. So if you believed that pulling the lever in that case was okay, then you would disagree with this first premise, right? But let's look at the second premise. There's some interesting discussion to be had there. Taking Teresa's organs would be killing her to save others. On the face of it, this seems obviously true. It will stop her heart from beating. It will stop her lungs from producing air, right? And whatever brain function she has, which is not much, but there is some functioning brain there, that will cease to happen too. So it seems obviously true that harvesting organs would be killing her. Rachel makes an interesting argument here. So what he notes here is our definition of death has actually changed over time. Let's take a look at that passage real quick. He says on my page 5, there's another possibility. Perhaps we should regard baby Teresa as already dead, so this would be an objection to the truth of premise 2. If this sounds crazy, bear in mind that our conception of death has changed over the years. In 1967, the South African doctor Christian Barnard performed the first heart transplant in a human being. This was an exciting development. Heart transplants could potentially save many lives. It was not clear, however, whether any lives could be saved in the United States. Back then, American law understood death as occurring when the heart stops beating, but once a heart stops beating, it quickly degrades and becomes unsuitable for transplant. Thus, under American law, it was not clear whether any hearts could be legally harvested for transplant. So American law changed. We now understand death as occurring not when the heart stops beating, but when the brain stops functioning. Brain death is our new end-of-life standard. This solved the problem about transplants because a brain-dead patient can still have a healthy heart suitable for transplant. So first, let's get clear about why we had to change the definition of death to do those heart transplants. We had to change the definition of death from somebody's heart stopping beating to somebody being brain dead. Why? Because we wanted to make it morally permissible for somebody to perform a heart transplant. If the definition of death was when your heart stops beating, then our corresponding definition of killing would be stopping somebody's heart from beating. And then for the doctor to perform the heart transplant, he would in effect have to kill someone to perform the heart transplant, I guess maybe bringing them back to life. But it seems weird to talk about what happens in a heart transplant in those terms. And we'd be in some sticky legal, on shaky legal ground and moral ground there. So we had to change the definition of death from the heart stopping beating to brain death to allow for people to do these heart transplants. So why did we do it? We did it for people's benefit, right? So more people would benefit, more people would be able to live rewarding lives, or at least longer lives. Now, this case doesn't help us with baby Teresa's case, because baby Teresa actually is not brain dead. So she does have a functioning brain. It will never be capable of conscious thought nor feeling, but her brain is functioning to the extent that it's keeping her lungs pumping and keeping her lungs working and keeping her heart pumping. So we can't say we should consider baby Teresa dead by our current definition of death. But what this case does draw our attention to is that we've changed the definition of death before, and we could change it again. And Rachel's is actually building a case that we should change the definition of death now again to make it a broader definition of death so that it would include cases of anencephalic babies, that we could consider them brain dead. So why does he make that case? Well, again, if we change the definition of death in this way, going back to earlier arguments, it wouldn't harm anyone because killing these infants would not actually be harming them because they're not losing their higher brain functions on which the value of life, he argues, depends. So it wouldn't be harming anybody, and it would be benefiting many people. So like the like when we changed the definition of death to allow for heart transplants, it would allow for saving more people without harming. Rachel's argues that that's what's going on here, that we should change the definition of death to allow the taking of the organs, because it would get around premise 2 here. It would say premise 2 is false. This would not be killing. If we change the definition of death to include anencephalic infants, then taking Teresa's organs would not be killing her. She would, by definition, already be dead. All right, so Rachel's concludes about this case that there are stronger arguments on the side of harvesting the organs and distributing them. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about this case in the discussion, but for now, let's move on to the case of Jody and Mary. So, to get us on the same page, I'll quickly read some details of the case. In August 2000, a young woman from Gozo, an island south of Italy, discovered that she was carrying conjoined twins. Knowing that the healthcare facilities on Gozo couldn't handle such a birth, she and her husband went to St. Mary's Hospital in Manchester, England. The infants, known as Mary and Jody, were joined at the lower abdomen. Their spines were fused, and they had one heart and one pair of lungs between them. Jody, the stronger one, was providing blood for her sister. No one knows how many sets of conjoined twins are born each year, but the number seems to be in the hundreds. Most die shortly after birth, but some do well. They grow to adulthood and marry and have children themselves. However, the outlook for Mary and Jody was grim. The doctors said that without intervention, the girls would die within 6 months. The only hope was an operation to separate them. This would save Jody, but Mary would die immediately. Now, the parents thought one thing should happen. Doctors and courts thought another thing should happen, but again, we're setting aside the question of who should decide what happens and focusing on the question of what should happen. So the first argument given is we should save as many as we can. So if we can save one person instead of letting 2 people die, we ought to do so. Let me clean that up a little bit. Then we ought to do so. Separating the twins would be saving one person instead of letting 2 people die. Therefore, we ought to separate the twins. If these premises are true, again, they lead to the conclusion. So, are the premises true? Well, the second premise seems true. Instead of letting 2 die, which they would within 6 months, separating the twins would allow one to live longer. So premise 2 seems true. What about premise 1? If we can save one person instead of letting 2 people die, then we ought to do so. One thing we might note about this premise is it, if true, would provide some exceptions to the rule it's wrong to kill an innocent person to save another. We saw that with the trolley problems, where if you pull the lever, you would kill an innocent person to save other people. Here, it seems like we'd be killing we'd be killing Mary to save Jody. But it seems at least many of you in the trolley problems thought if we can save one person instead of letting 2 people die, then we ought to do so. So if that premise is true, it seems that the second premise is also true, so this argument would go through. But of course, that first premise, we saw some controversy in that with regard to the trolley problems. Expect to see some controversy with regard to this argument here. 78% of people, it says in the text, approved of this operation, but that doesn't really tell us much about whether it's morally right or not. So let's look at the next argument. The argument from the sanctity of human life. First premise, we should not kill innocent human beings. This premise coming back again, right? Separating the twins would be killing an innocent human being. Therefore, we should not separate the twins. So, Here, again, these premises, if true, would lead to the conclusion. Are they true? We should not kill innocent human beings. Maybe there are some counterexamples. If we can save many other people, if both are going to die and we can save one. But if this premise is true, and if the next one certainly seems true, separating the twins would be killing an innocent human being. In fact, it would be killing Mary to save Jody. So then it seems like this argument goes through, and we should believe the conclusion. But the courts actually thought differently. The courts thought that the operation would not be killing. Sorry, I've been saying it wrong. Would not be killing Mary to save Jody. It would be letting Mary die. Now, what were they trying to do by saying that? They were trying to get around this argument. They were trying to say that premise 2 was not true, that it wouldn't be killing an innocent human being. It would just be the operation would just be letting an innocent human being die. Now, their argument gains some support. When I looked this up, I wasn't clear what joined at the abdomen meant, so I looked this up to try to get more information. So, and I found this diagram. So Jody is on one side, Mary is on the other, and I wanted to see if the picture of what was going on would give any clarity or support for this argument that separating them wouldn't be killing Mary, it would just be allowing her to die. So you see in this diagram that the heart is over there in number 1. It's over there in what we would call Jody's chest. The lungs are over there in what we would call Jody's chest. The abdomen is more towards that side. The oxygen flows from the lung that appears to be in Jody's left side to all the way through Mary over to what we would call Jody's right side. And when I looked at this, it made me think, oh, maybe the judges were right. Maybe this would just be separating them and Mary wouldn't be able to sustain her own life, so it wouldn't be killing Mary, it would just be letting her die. Rachel's in the text disagrees with this argument, and let me read what he says. So he says, the response that it's letting die, not killing, misses the point. It doesn't matter whether we say that the operation caused Mary's death or that her body's weakness did. Either way, she will be dead, and we will knowingly have hastened her death. That's the idea behind the traditional prohibition against killing the innocent. So if we hasten the death of somebody, we are killing them, regardless of whether their body can sustain them or not. Imagine somebody was using an external lung to breathe for them, and we separated them from that external lung, and our defense was that we didn't kill them, we just separated them from that lung and then let them die. That would be a laughable defense, right? Now imagine that external lung happens to be in somebody else's body, right? Now it again seems that the defense that we're separating them and letting the other one die would be laughable. The lung that it's using, that's giving the being air, is seems to have some claim over it. And to say it's the other, to say that this lung or this heart, these lungs or this heart is Jody's and not at all Mary's, seems to at the very least be really contentious, right? And since Mary is using the heart and lungs, and they're helping keep her alive, to separate them and call it a letting die seems disingenuous, but it is controversial, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. All right, so how does Rachel's ultimately attack this argument? He rejects the attack on premise 2, that this would not be a case of killing. He says this would be a case of killing. He actually rejects premise 1. He says there are cases where it might be permissible to kill innocent human beings. And those cases, he said, would have to meet 3 conditions. The innocent human has no future because she's going to die soon, no matter what. The innocent human has no wish to go on living, perhaps because she has no wishes at all. And C, this killing will save others who can go on to lead full lives. In these rare circumstances, he said, the killing of the innocent might be justified. Now we might wonder whether all 3 of these cases are met. One thing to note is it seems that these conditions are met in the Teresa case. She's going to die soon, in fact, within the week, no matter what. She has no wish to go on living. She has no wishes at all. She never will have wishes. And the killing will save others that her organs will go to. But how about this case? Does this case meet these 3 criteria? The innocent human has no future because she's going to be die soon anyways, no matter what. Well, she is going to die in 6 months. Are we going to call that soon? Is it soon enough? B, the innocent human has no wish to go on living, perhaps because she has no wishes at all. I haven't looked up the details of this case. It might be interesting to look at those and consider whether or not Mary in this case does have any wishes, is capable of forming wishes in the future. And the killing will save others who can go on to lead full lives. That seems right. This operation would kill Mary to save Jody. But while it clearly meets C, does it meet the conditions for A and B? That's I'll leave that up for discussion. All right, so now let's look at the third case. Case of Tracy Latimer. So really quickly, Tracy Latimer, a 12-year-old victim of cerebral palsy, was killed by her father in 1993. Tracy lived with her family on a prairie farm in Saskatchewan, Canada. One Sunday morning, while his wife and other children were at church, Robert Latimer put Tracy in the cab of his pickup truck and piped exhaust fumes until she died. At the time of her death, Tracy weighed less than 40 pounds, and she was described as functioning at the mental level of a 3-month-old baby. Mrs. Latimer said that she was relieved to find Tracy dead when she arrived home. She said that she didn't have the courage to do it herself. The question again will be, should Robert Latimer have done this? Was he wrong to do it? Or was it permissible? So should he have done it? Some details of the case that are important. Well, we'll look at the arguments first. So the first is the argument from the wrongness of discriminating against the handicapped. So Tracy Latimer having cerebral palsy, the argument goes the killing was a case of discrimination. So we should not discriminate against any group of people. Robert killing Tracy was an act of discrimination against the handicapped, therefore he should not have killed her. Some people apparently agreed with this argument. The voice of the people with Saskatoon Voice of the People with Disabilities thought that this was a case of discrimination. Robert Latimer, for his part, disagreed. He said the reason he killed her was not because she had cerebral palsy. The reason he killed her was because she was suffering so much. And the suffering that they detail in this case is quite a bit. So he said, people are saying this is a handicap issue, but they're wrong. This is a torture issue. It was about mutilation and torture for Tracy. Just before her death, Tracy had undergone major surgery on her back, hips, and legs, and more surgery was planned. With the combination of feeding tube, rods in her back, the leg cut and flopping around, and bed sores, said her father, "How can people say she was a happy little girl?" 3 of her physicians testified about the difficulty of controlling her pain. So Robert Latimer says he killed her not because of her disability or her handicap, but because of her pain. Now it's tricky because her pain is a result of her handicap, but also in conjunction with all the surgeries that she had to undergo and the difficulty of controlling her pain. It makes it especially heartbreaking when we think about she had the mental state of a 3-month-old baby. 3-month-old babies can't understand that the operations that are happening, the pain that they're currently facing, might be for their own good. So this will just seem like pain for her from start to finish.
Take your trash.
No, thanks. So Robert built the case that this was not a case of discrimination, and I tend to agree, but again, it will be interesting to hear what you think about this. So the next argument is against, against Robert killing Tracy. So if we do not punish Robert for killing Tracy, then we will end up allowing other people to decide who should live and die. Therefore, we should punish Robert for killing Tracy. So this is like a slippery slope argument. We need to stop this somewhere. Otherwise, as the text says, we'll eventually get to Hitler's program of eugenics. So where do we draw the line with killings like this? Well, it seems that we could set some reasonable boundaries for when it would be okay and when it wouldn't be okay. When might it be okay if the person who is killed is terminal, if they're going to be in pain, if every day is going to be worse than their last, if they're incapable of consenting now or ever capable of consenting. Maybe if a case meets that criteria, maybe this would be okay. These are just ideas I'm floating off the top of my head. But let me just say this. The way to counter slippery slope arguments is by providing clear, necessary, and sufficient criteria for when something would be okay and when it wouldn't be okay. So be suspicious of slippery slope arguments. They rely on predictions about the future that might not come true. In this case, the people presenting the slippery slope argument were saying, look, if we don't punish him here, then it'll be a slippery slope, and pretty soon we'll have no way of stopping people from killing other people for all sorts of reasons. But if we specify what the acceptable conditions are for this killing and when they aren't, then maybe we can defend against that. So now let's talk about what the take-home message of this chapter is. So, having discussed these cases, James Rachel's is going to try to draw some general lessons about morality and any conception of morality. And the first that he's going to talk about is in a section called Reason and Impartiality. So he presents an argument there for using moral reasoning. As we saw when we were discussing these various moral cases, we considered arguments, we analyzed the arguments, we considered a variety of moral principles, we asked whether those principles were good principles, whether they applied to the particular cases we were looking at, whether we were abiding by the standards of logic when we were looking for what was morally good or not, when we were deciding what was morally good or not. And Rachel's argues that that's the correct way to approach morality, to approach ethics, is we need to use reasoning, not just our feelings. And his argument for that is this. So the first premise, people's feelings have often misled them with regard to what was right. And this seems very evident. So people have felt, various cultures have had beliefs that we would find atrocious now. Even in this country, not all that long ago, many, if not most people, felt that slavery was morally permissible. And that was their gut feeling. That was sort of the common sense of the time. And that was horribly wrong. It's not okay to enslave people for your own purposes or other people's benefit. So it seems very clear that people's feelings have misled them with regard to what was right and wrong. In other words, they were wrong. If people were wrong about slavery, which they certainly were, then people's feelings can mislead them about what's morally right and wrong. Second, people's feelings can be very different about moral issues and specific cases. So there's disagreement. People have different gut reactions to these cases. And the different gut reactions can't both be right. If they're, some of you felt one way about certain trolley problems, some of you felt the other way. And you can't both be right. An action can't be both right and wrong, in other words. So somebody's got to be wrong. Given this disagreement, if there's a truth, then somebody must be wrong. So feelings lead us in different directions. So the conclusion to draw from that is people's feelings are not a reliable guide to finding the truth about moral issues, if there is a truth. And for this class, since it's an ethics class, not a meta-ethics course, we will be assuming there is some truth about moral issues. And I don't think that's a bad assumption. If there weren't a truth when it came to moral issues, then when somebody wronged us, we'd have no way of explaining to them why what they did was wrong. If they said, look, I just feel like it's right? So it seems that morality has something to do with feelings, but it also has quite a bit to do with reasoning. So if we want to find the truth about moral issues, we should not rely solely on our feelings when considering questions of morality. And though Rachel's doesn't come outright and say this, I think the next premise is important in his argument. He believes that reason is more reliable than feelings when it comes to finding the truth about moral issues. He doesn't support that claim. He doesn't even state it. It's an interesting one to wonder about. I know there are times in my life where I felt a certain way about things, but then the closer I looked at the scenario, the more I thought about the various moral principles in play, I changed my mind. Who's to say whether I was right with my gut feeling or whether my more informed, more reasonable stance was right? I tend to side with the reasoning. That's unsurprising. Rachel's does too. So he argues, if we want to find the truth about moral issues, we must let our feelings about morality be guided as much as possible by reason. So he's not saying reject your feelings entirely. Your initial gut reaction to a case is a thing to consider, but we should probably also consider various moral principles, various arguments on either side to figure out whether something is morally permissible, whether it's morally good, whether it's morally bad. It would be weird if we didn't. I mean, imagine somebody who was charged with a crime went before a jury or a judge, and the judge said, oh, I just feel like you're guilty. I'm not even going to look at the arguments. We would think that was horribly unjust, right? We would think that they should consider arguments on both sides, and that would be a better guideline for figuring out the truth of the matter. So I think that applies just as much here. We did see, so in some of the discussion about the trolley problems, there were some strong initial feelings about it. And some people even said some things like, you just look at this case and you know what's right? What I would wonder is how would you know what's right? Is it a feeling that's guiding you, a strong feeling that initially strikes you? Well, if so, then that can be, that feeling can misguide you. If it's a moral principle that you know, then, well, now, if that's the source of your knowledge, well, now we can have arguments for and against your principle and your arguments stemming from that principle. So, I don't think that we can look at a case or a person and immediately know whether the action is right or wrong, or the person is good or bad. I think we need to weigh arguments on each side. So how do we go about this? How do we use our moral reasoning? Well, Rachel's offers a two-step process. So first we've got to get the facts straight, then we've got to apply the moral principles. So we saw in each case we looked at, in each argument we considered, the second premise was always a statement about the facts of the case. And the first premise was always applying a moral principle to the case, or stating a general principle that then we applied to the facts of the case. But getting the facts straight is really important. We want to make sure that any bias we might have is not preventing us from seeing the facts of the case as they are. We saw when we were looking at the case of Mary and Jody that the facts of the case might have weighed on our decision when we were deciding whether or not performing the operation was killing Mary or just letting Mary die. So we looked up where the heart was, where the lungs were, and while the facts of the matter had us leaning one way, some arguments that I presented at least made me lean the other way. So, but first we do have to get the facts straight. They can have important bearing on what we think about the case. Next, apply a moral principle. So we can't just go from the facts to a moral judgment. There needs to be some general moral principle that gives us a guideline to jump from the facts to the judgment. You can say everything you want about matters of fact, but that'll never lead you to an ought. As one philosopher famously said, you can't derive an ought from an is. You need some kind of moral principle to get you to that moral judgment. So, next is the requirement of impartiality. So, Rachel's has an argument for this. If there's no good reason for treating people differently, then discrimination is unacceptably arbitrary. In cases of racism and sexism, there's no good reason for treating people differently. In other words, the skin color that somebody has, the parents that they have, their sex or gender, none of these things are good reasons for treating people differently. The way they act are good, morally relevant reasons for treating people differently. So discrimination in those cases where it comes down to race or sex are unacceptably arbitrary. We should reject those. And Rachel's argues we should be impartial. We should consider the facts of the case. We should consider the moral principles. We shouldn't discriminate against people because of these non-morally relevant features of people. All right, so what does that, what's the conception of morality that this leads to? So the minimum conception of morality, he says, the features that any acceptable morality will have. Any acceptable morality, he says, will be, at the very least, the effort to guide one's conduct by reason. That is, to do what they're the best reasons for doing. We talked about some arguments on both sides of each of these cases. He says we should do the right thing is what has the best, strongest arguments on the side of that action, while giving equal weight to the interests of each individual affected by one's decision. So we shouldn't say somebody doesn't matter in our calculation because of things that are not morally relevant, like their race or gender or something like this. So any acceptable morality will have these features. And then this leads Rachel's to his picture of the conscientious moral agent. The conscientious moral agent, he says, will act on this minimum conception of morality. So somebody who's concerned impartially with the interests of everyone affected by what he or she does, who carefully sifts facts and examines their implications, who accepts principles of conduct only after scrutinizing them to make sure they're justified, who's willing to listen to reason, even when it means revising prior convictions, and who finally is willing to act on these deliberations. Now, at each stage in this, there are difficulties, right? So listening, having initial feelings, being willing to listen to reason, to revise your judgments if the arguments weigh against your initial feeling, and then changing your behavior to do whatever they're the best arguments for. At each stage, this is tremendously difficult, but nobody ever said morality or ethics was easy. So Rachel's hopes that we'll all be conscientious moral agents, adopt his minimum conception of morality. When we look at big moral theories in the future, we'll see how they line up or how they might diverge from this minimum conception of morality. But that's all of the lecture for today. For now, we'll go on to quiz questions. So the first quiz question. The claim that killing baby Teresa would not be harming her is a response to an objection to which premise of the benefits argument? Is it a response to an objection to premise 1? That would be, your answer would be A. Is it a response to premise 2? Or a response to the third claim? That would be C. So which premise is the claim that killing Teresa would not be harming her a response to? So that's a response to an objection to a premise. Which premise is the objection to? You can go back and look at that part of the lecture to help you out, and you can check the textbook. Quiz question number 2. Why does Rachels think, so the author of our textbook, why does Rachels think that we should consider Teresa already dead? A, it would ease our consciences if we decide that she should be killed. B, she meets the current definition of death, which is brain dead. Or C, we've changed the definition of death before to make life better for everyone, and she will never have a life. Which is the reason that Rachels presents to support his claim that we should consider Teresa already dead? And then quiz question number 3. Why does Rachels hold that the argument from the sanctity of human life perhaps should not lead us to conclude that Jody and Mary should not be separated? So why should we still think possibly that Jody and Mary should be separated, even in the face of the argument for the sanctity of human life? Does he support that there are some circumstances in which killing an innocent human being is justified? Or does he hold that the operation would not kill Mary, it would just let her die? Or the innocent human being in question has not yet been born, so it's okay to be killed? Which of those reasons does Rachel support, and does he hold up as a reason that there might be reason to separate Jody and Mary? Yeah. All right. So thanks for listening. I know this was a long one. In the future, the lectures will be a little bit shorter. I will see you next time when we talk about utilitarianism, and I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say on the discussion board. All right. Thanks all.